Talking Trees with Lily and Jad. Welcome to Talking Trees. Today we spotlight the International Day of Forests, a UN-declared celebration promoting forest awareness. We'll also explore Singapore's City Biodiversity Index, a comprehensive tool featuring 28 indicators designed to help cities assess and enhance urban biodiversity, ecosystem services, and green infrastructure. Let's dive in.
Happy International Day of Forests to all you arborists out there.
Oh, yeah.
It's a day the UN set aside to really appreciate just how vital forests are to our world.
Absolutely.
Now, I think for you guys as arborists,
Yeah.
this day has a special kind of resonance, given all the work you do managing and protecting these incredible ecosystems.
You're absolutely right. It's a great opportunity to take a step back and think about the big picture of what we do.
Yeah.
But today we're going to go beyond traditional forestry
Okay.
into the really fascinating world of urban environments.
Yes, we're diving into something called the Singapore Index. It might not be something that comes up every day in your work, but trust me, it's got a lot to offer in terms of understanding and improving biodiversity, even in a bustling city.
Exactly. You know, it's easy to think of deforestation as something happening far away in rainforests.
Yeah.
But the reality is we're losing a crazy amount of forest every year.
Yeah.
Over 13 million hectares, to put that in perspective.
Wow.
That's roughly the size of England.
Oh, way.
Vanishing every year.
That's a sobering thought. And I bet most people don't realize
Yeah.
that deforestation contributes almost as much to global carbon emissions as the entire transportation sector does, somewhere between 12 and 18%.
It's a real reminder of how interconnected our planet is.
Yeah.
And it highlights how important trees are.
Yeah.
Not just in remote forests, but right here in our cities, too.
Right.
And that's where you, as urban arborists, come in.
Yeah.
Your work planting and maintaining trees directly helps reduce those emissions.
So how does the Singapore Index fit into all of this?
So the Singapore Index is a self-assessment tool for cities to measure how they're doing in terms of biodiversity conservation. Think of it as a benchmark to see how well a city is doing in terms of protecting and enhancing its natural assets.
I'm starting to see the connection here.
Right.
But how does it actually work? Is it just about counting the number of trees in a city?
It goes way beyond that.
Okay.
It takes a holistic approach,
Okay.
looking at three main components.
Right.
Native biodiversity in the city,
Okay.
the ecosystem services provided by that biodiversity, and how the city is governing and managing all of this.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit, starting with native biodiversity in the city.
Sure.
What exactly does that entail? Is it just about having parks and green spaces?
It's more nuanced than that.
Okay.
It looks at things like the proportion of natural areas within the city,
Okay.
how well those areas are connected, and the presence of native species,
Right.
especially within built-up areas where you often work.
So it's not just about having little pockets of nature here and there.
Right.
It's about making sure they're part of a larger functioning ecosystem.
You got it.
Okay.
One really interesting indicator in this component
Yeah.
actually focuses on the number of native bird species found in built-up areas.
Oh, interesting.
It's a clever way to see how well a city is really integrating biodiversity into its fabric, rather than just relegating it to parks and reserves.
As an arborist, I can already see how my choices about which trees to plant could make a real difference in supporting those bird populations.
Yeah, absolutely.
So say a city scores well in this first component. What about those ecosystem services you mentioned?
Yeah, so that's where things get really interesting, especially for you as arborists.
Okay.
This component looks at all the tangible benefits that biodiversity brings to city dwellers.
Check it.
Things like regulating water quantity,
Right.
helping with climate regulation through trees and greenery,
Yeah.
providing recreational opportunities in parks, and even promoting the health and well-being of residents.
I could definitely see the connection to our work here.
Yeah.
We're not just planting trees to make a city look pretty.
Right.
We're directly contributing to a city's ability to manage water resources, cool down those urban heat islands, and create spaces where people can connect with nature.
You're hitting the nail on the head by thinking about these ecosystem services.
Yeah.
Your work as arborists goes from simply tree care to shaping a healthier and more sustainable urban environment.
That's a powerful way to think about our role
Yeah.
in the bigger picture of city planning. But what about that third component you mentioned?
Right.
The governance and management side of things.
Yeah.
It sounds a bit more bureaucratic and less hands-on.
It might seem that way at first,
Yeah.
but it's equally important.
Okay.
This component delves into things like institutional capacity.
Okay.
So are there dedicated biodiversity centers, botanical gardens, research institutions focused on urban ecology? It also assesses the budget allocated to biodiversity.
So are they putting their money where their mouth is when it comes to protecting urban nature?
Exactly. And perhaps most importantly,
Yeah.
it examines whether a city has a local biodiversity strategy and action plan,
Okay.
a concrete roadmap for how they plan to protect and enhance their natural assets.
That sounds crucial.
Yeah.
Without a plan, even the best intentions can get lost in the shuffle of city development.
Absolutely. And this component also encourages cities to do something called natural capital assessments.
Okay.
Basically putting a tangible value on the benefits provided by nature.
It's like finally acknowledging that nature isn't just something nice to have.
Right.
It's a vital part of our urban infrastructure and should be treated as such.
You got it. And the fascinating thing is the Singapore Index isn't static.
Okay.
It's actually been revised and updated to incorporate the latest trends in biodiversity conservation and climate change.
So it's a living document constantly evolving to reflect the latest knowledge and best practices.
Exactly. It's designed to be adaptable to a city's unique context,
Okay.
providing a framework for cities to make informed decisions
Yeah.
about creating greener, healthier, and more biodiverse urban environments.
I'm really starting to see the potential of the Singapore Index.
Yeah.
It's not just a theoretical tool.
Right.
It's a practical guide for cities.
Yeah.
And for professionals like us to create a more sustainable future. You mentioned that cities use the Singapore Index as a self-assessment tool.
Right.
What does that look like in practice?
So cities basically go through this detailed process of evaluating themselves against a set of indicators, which are grouped under those three main components we talked about. Native biodiversity ecosystem services and governance and management.
So it's like a checklist of best practices for urban biodiversity.
That's a good way to put it. And one of the most important things to remember is it's not about getting a perfect score.
Right.
It's about figuring out where a city is doing well and, more importantly, where they need to step up their game.
That makes sense. It's about using the index as a roadmap for action, not just a pat on the back.
Exactly.
Could you give me an example of what some of these indicators look like in the native biodiversity component?
Sure. Let's take the indicator on connectivity measures. Remember how we talked about creating those wildlife highways to allow species to move freely throughout the city?
Yeah, the image of birds navigating a concrete jungle is a powerful one.
Well, this indicator looks at how well a city's natural areas are linked, through corridors, greenways, and even just patches of suitable habitat in more developed areas.
Okay, so like stepping stones.
Exactly.
I'm already seeing how this connects to my work as an arborist.
Right.
If I'm planting trees along a street, for example, I could choose species that provide food and shelter for birds, creating those stepping stones for them to move through the city.
That's the kind of thinking the Singapore Index encourages.
Yeah.
Recognizing that every tree we plant can play a role in supporting biodiversity, even in those super urbanized environments.
Okay, now I'm curious about the ecosystem services component. What are some examples of indicators that would be relevant to arborists?
One that jumps out is climate regulation benefits of trees and greenery.
Okay.
This indicator measures the tree canopy cover in a city and how that canopy is being managed to deal with climate change.
Yeah, we all know trees are super important for absorbing carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen, but they also play a big role in cooling down cities.
You're right. They provide shade, which helps reduce that urban heat island effect.
Right.
The Singapore Index encourages cities to not just plant more trees, but to manage existing trees in a way that maximizes those climate benefits.
So things like making sure there's a good variety of tree species and planting trees in places that'll maximize shade.
Exactly. It's about going beyond simply increasing the number of trees and thinking strategically about how we can use them to create a more comfortable and climate-resilient urban environment.
This is starting to make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering how the Singapore Index deals with something as complicated as climate change. It seems like such a huge global issue. How can a city-level tool really make a difference?
That's a great question. The index doesn't shy away from these big challenges. It actually has an indicator called biodiversity-related responses to climate change.
Okay, tell me more.
So this indicator looks at how cities are using nature-based solutions, which often involve trees and green spaces, to both adapt to the impacts of climate change and reduce their own contributions to the problem.
Okay, can you give me a concrete example?
Sure. Think about the increasing risks of flooding because of sea level rise and more intense rainfall. A city might use the Singapore Index to assess how well they're protecting and restoring coastal wetlands.
Because those wetlands act like natural sponges, absorbing excess water and protecting the city from floods?
Exactly. And the index also encourages cities to plant trees in a way that reduces the urban heat island effect, making the city more livable during those heat waves.
It seems like by incorporating these indicators, cities can really start to weave climate resilience into how they design their urban spaces, from parks and green spaces to streetscapes and even building codes.
You're getting it. It's a holistic approach. And that's what makes the Singapore Index so powerful.
Now, what about that third component, governance and management?
Okay.
I'm still not quite clear on how that translates into real-world action.
So this is where we go from the what to the how.
Yeah.
We've been talking about how important things like connectivity, ecosystem services, and climate resilience are.
Yeah.
But this component focuses on the ways we actually made those things happen.
So it's about having the right policies, regulations, and resources in place to support biodiversity.
Exactly. And it looks at things like institutional capacity. Does the city have a dedicated department or agency focused on biodiversity?
Okay.
Are there enough resources to actually put those nature-based solutions we talked about into action?
So it's not enough to just want to do good. You need the infrastructure and support to actually get it done.
Precisely. And one of the most important indicators in this component is having a local biodiversity strategy and action plan.
We touched on that earlier. It's about having a solid plan.
Right. This is where a city lays out what they want to achieve with biodiversity, sets specific goals, and figures out the steps they'll take to get there.
It's like a blueprint for a biodiverse and sustainable city.
Exactly. And the Singapore Index encourages cities to make this plan as all-encompassing as possible, integrating biodiversity into everything from city planning to management.
So it's not just the Parks Department's job.
Yeah.
It's about getting everyone involved.
Right.
Transportation planners, developers, community groups, even regular citizens.
You got it. It's about creating a culture of biodiversity where protecting and enhancing nature is a shared responsibility.
This has been so insightful. I'm really starting to see how the Singapore Index can be such a useful tool.
Yeah.
Not just for cities, but for professionals like me who work in urban environments.
I'm glad to hear that.
Now I'm excited to hear some examples of cities actually using this knowledge to make a difference.
You know, it's one thing to have a framework like the Singapore Index, but it's a whole other thing to see it put into practice. And the good news is there are cities around the world using it to make real progress.
Awesome. Let's jump into some of those examples. What kind of success are we seeing out there?
Well, one city that comes to mind is Lisbon, Portugal. After trying out the Singapore Index, they realized they didn't have a clear plan for biodiversity conservation. So they went ahead and developed a local biodiversity strategy and action plan.
That's great. They really took the index and used it to make changes. What did that look like in practice? What kinds of things did they change?
They did a lot of things. Like improving how connected green spaces are. Restoring ecosystems that had been degraded. And even starting citizen science programs to monitor biodiversity.
I bet those citizen science programs are a great way to get the whole community involved.
Absolutely.
It's not just experts telling people what needs to happen. It's about everyone feeling responsible for taking care of their environment.
Exactly. And Lisbon's efforts have paid off.
Oh, that's great.
They've seen a big increase in bird species in the city.
Wow.
And they've made this network of green corridors, which are good for wildlife. And give residents places to relax and enjoy nature.
Sounds like a win-win for everyone. Are there any other cities having success with the Singapore Index?
For sure. Another inspiring example is Curitiba, Brazil. They've been leaders in sustainable urban planning for years.
That's great.
And they've used the Singapore Index to do even more.
What makes Curitiba so special?
Well, they have a really unique way of doing public transportation. Which has helped to reduce traffic and air pollution.
Makes sense.
And they've also put a lot of effort into making parks and green spaces all over the city.
It sounds like a city that really cares about its people.
They do, and you can see the results.
How so?
They have more trees than average for a city their size. And they've seen a big decrease in the urban heat island effect.
So I'm noticing something here. The cities that are doing well with the Singapore Index all seem to have one thing in common.
What's that?
They're all thinking about the bigger picture and making biodiversity a central part of how they plan their cities.
You're absolutely right. It's not about treating nature as something extra or something separate from the city.
Yeah.
It's about making it part of everything the city does. Happy International Day of Forests, everyone, and thanks for joining us.
Yes, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the world of urban biodiversity.
Until next time.
Keep exploring.
Keep learning.
And keep diving deep.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Talking Trees. Today, we celebrated the International Day of Forests and explored Singapore's City Biodiversity Index, a vital tool for cities aiming to protect and enhance urban biodiversity. We hope this discussion sparks new ideas for integrating nature into our urban environments. Stay tuned for more. Until next time, continue nurturing the world around you